Welcome everyone to Chapter 3, Analysis of Don Quixote, alternatively titled There's No Such Thing as a Simple Don Quixote Chapter, which has become our kind of informal, I think that it's fair to say that's become our informal motto for this series, because every single time we look at a chapter, we see how little it seems to cover. For example, in this chapter, I think I'll ask one of you to give us a brief synopsis, but when you do, we'll see that not much seems to happen, but there's a whole lot to explore and unpack here. So, Kia or Tudor, which of you would prefer to just briefly summarize what happens in this chapter 3?
I don't mind.
Please, could you go ahead for us then?
Okay, so at the beginning of the chapter, he's at the inn and he's kind of just finishing his dinner when he's really bugged by the fact that he's still not a knight.
Yeah.
And so he immediately goes to the innkeeper, who I think is in the stable at the time, and then he gets on his knees and he's like, I'm not getting off my knees until you make me a knight. And then the guy's like, okay, I guess. And so then he agrees that he'll make him a knight, but then they say, no, there's no chapel. So he arranges, and then I think Don Quixote is like, no, he'll prove that he can be a knight by watching his arms. I think that's what the purpose of that was.
Yes.
Um, and then so the innkeeper's like, great. And then he's kind of amused by the situation. So he kind of plays along. It's not really like a, a genuine thing, more like a mockery sort of thing, it seems. And then he arranges that Don Quixote can go watch his arms in the yard, and then if he can do it until morning, then he'll knight him. And yeah, that's kind of the setup. But then Don Quixote puts his armor in the trough, and then I think this kind of means that he's naked in the yard because
Yeah.
all he has is his armor. I think that's
No, I think he is wearing clothes underneath. He's wearing like almost like
yeah.
long john like
Yeah, I mean, I
underwears.
think that is what I meant by that. But
Oh, okay.
yeah, not very dignified in
Exactly.
this kind of encounter. And then the innkeeper kind of tells everyone at the inn that this is happening, and then everyone in the inn goes out and kind of wants to see what he's doing, and he's kind of marching back and forth in front of his armor. And then I think there's two guys that kind of try and mess with him. I can't remember what the first one does, but the second guy I think just wanted to give water to the pigs, and his arm is in the trough, and then he kind of bonks both of them on the head. And then the village kind of starts stoning him because this is a bit of a problem. And then the innkeeper kind of is like, no, like he can't be culpable. He's insane. Even if he kills lots of people, he can't really be held responsible.
Hmm.
So then he kind of convinces them to leave him alone. And then he's like, you know what, you deserve everything. I'm gonna knight you.
Yeah.
We can move on. And then yeah, I think it ends with him being knighted and then kind of goes off after that.
Exactly, precisely. Yeah, thank you for summarizing that. A lot that we can look into here. I always like accompanying what we do with these Gustave Doré illustrations and engravings because they give us a good idea of what's going on, you know. Lesedi, you've just joined us. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. How's everyone doing? I
Oh, we're
just had
doing
to
well.
finish washing the dishes quickly.
Completely normal. We probably actually shouldn't have started recording before you came. We should have kept that in mind. Anyway, you are here now, and that's what's important. So, well, of course, we've just received from here a very neat synopsis of chapter 3. Before I start with some of my comments, is there something you guys would like to, maybe I'll go through you one by one, and I'd like to see what you all think of this chapter, what your overall thoughts are. Maybe Tudor, you can start us off here.
Mm, well, I think this, for me, it seemed like a really simple chapter.
Hmm.
But maybe what's a bit more interesting is that there's the dynamic where at the beginning of the chapter, you see how sort of there's a play into Don Quixote's desire to become a knight,
Hmm.
and then sort of how afterwards Don Quixote's presence becomes sort of a nuisance to the people.
Interesting.
And then the only way to sort of get him to no longer like be bothering or disrupting a situation or causing problems, let's say for the innkeeper or for the people that is now knocked out, the two people coming to the trap, is to sort of play into what he wants so that he can move along.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is an interesting point because it touches on a lot of what we discovered last time. This first interaction of Don Quixote with society outside of his own household, and there's always this question: do the people, do others accommodate Don Quixote in his apparent madness, or do they oppose him? And it's interesting that you, of course, say that y the accommodating him isn't an easy thing to do either, because actually
No.
you can end up putting yourself in a dangerous situation. I mean, the one swineherd that he attacks, I mean, he nearly beats to death. It's said, I think, I may forget the Spanish, but I don't have it directly in front of me. But the words are something like he nearly beats his brains out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the point is then, and then you point out that really interesting factor, which is that now the resolution to the danger seems to come as a consequence of their accommodation of Don Quixote. But then the danger is also resolved by indulging him further, right? So that's a pretty, I found that kind of, I didn't think of that at all until you've mentioned it. Kia, what are your thoughts generally about this chapter?
Um, I think my thoughts around this chapter have just kind of resolved around the question of what a knight actually is.
Very good.
So like I just kind of watching the world that is depicted in Alla Triste, which I mean it does kind of reflect what this guy looks like, the innkeeper, and like how unfriendly that world is, and how like ideal the knight errant is. But then like the actual knights were military. They were cavalrymen, and they were defending borders, and they were part of teams. Like this idea that he has of this knight, of this like individual nobleman that, you know, goes on adventures and does it in the name of romance. Where does that come from? Is kind
That's
of been my main
That's a really
question.
good point. And that's something in reading this chapter, I've actually been trying to read up on and understand a bit better, because this whole question of chivalry is a lot more complex than we give credit for. I think
Yeah.
we become somewhat cynical about it. So we look at the codes of chivalry and we think, you know, it's almost expected in a history book. Whenever someone mentions the code of chivalry, the historian then has to say something like, yes, but there are all these exceptions. So you see all these examples of knights like, you know, butchering villages and, you know,
Yeah.
abusing women, etc. I think somewhat we might be a bit too cynical about this. And I think we are we're not grasping the essence of what chivalry is about. And
Yeah.
uh, I think there's actually something a lot deeper going on here. So we'll discuss that a bit later, because it's not actually something I'm fully, it's something I'd like to do a lot more research on, so I can't offer
Mm.
the full answer, but I can give some, I can give sort of a sketch towards a probable resolution to this problem. Because you are quite right that this is the first instance that we see Don Quixote truly engaging with the rites of chivalry. So there's something quite
Mm.
sacramental about what's going on with this ritual, and again, I want to delve a bit more into that as soon as I hear from Lassetti what his general thoughts are of this chapter.
Okay, so my line of thinking is like slightly different from everyone else's. Sorry. And it's in relation to his supposed love interest.
Mm.
Because of how delusional he is, I'm wondering if he's gonna take the rejection that he got as like motivation to like win her over, with his exploits of something along those lines. I'm just wondering how that's gonna play out, considering how delusional he is.
Yeah, interesting. So would he respond like a normal person when he eventually gets closer to Dulcinea del Toboso, who of course doesn't well, in a way, she doesn't exist, right? Dulcinea del Toboso is sort of an idealized vision of one of the girls in his village. Um, that's actually, interestingly enough, something that's more prominent in part two. So it's actually interesting that except for his invoking of Dulcinea, almost his prayers to Dulcinea, she hardly features in part one. That actually might be
Wait,
something interesting to
I
think of.
think wait, maybe I'm confusing, but I'm referencing the innkeeper's daughter that he thought was a noble lady.
I think that might be. So we are talking about. I might also be confused because I think what you're saying registers somewhat. I know that there's a part like that, but I don't know if it's necessarily. I might have missed something in this chapter. Um, or it might be in because what Don Quixote does is it's got a lot of these parallel chapters, so that kind of thing may even happen a little bit later, or it may happen in this chapter and I've just missed it. Because it does, you're definitely right that that kind of thing does happen. Maybe Kia and Tudor can help me out here. My memory is
Uh,
failing.
so I could be wrong, but I think right before he hits one of the guys on the head, he kind of calls upon the blessing of Lady Dulcinea.
Yeah, that is
So that's
definitely true.
possibly one of them. But in terms of like the ladies at the thing, I think at the end of the chapter he gives them new names. So he's like, "You are now Donna. Please assume the name of Donna."
Yeah, exactly. So
Um,
I think you are, in a sense, you're right, but it might be just a little bit later in this in this uh, in this part of the book. Again, I'm a little bit confused because I know that my recalling of the events isn't exact because what you're saying does definitely happen, Lissetti. It does definitely happen, but I don't know if it happens in this chapter. What we were actually commenting on just before, at the very beginning, is actually surprisingly little seems to happen in this chapter, and that's something that I keep uh, reminding myself as I reread this book is that chapter by chapter, I assumed a lot more happens, but it doesn't actually. So, but that's useful for us because there's actually so much that we can address. His relationship with Dulcinea is going to become extremely important as we move on, and also his perseverance vis-a-vis her. Okay, so maybe what I'll do is I will pose a few points to start off. So what we have is we have the situation, as you mentioned, Kia. Don Quixote becomes aware that he's actually not a knight. So he's not recognized as a knight because he hasn't adopted this ritual. He hasn't performed this ritual of being knighted. Now, Roberto González Echeverría, who's an expert on Don Quixote from Yale, in one of his lectures, he goes so far as to call this sort of a mock baptism, and he refers to a whole number of previous uh, analysts or readers who have also seen this as a sort of mock baptism. I'm not so certain about this. I don't think that this is kind of like a mock baptism as much as it is a mock knighting. I think it's a lot simpler than that. I don't think we necessarily have to read all the parallels. I think there's a baptismal element in the sense of being like initiated into a new state of life, but the knighting ceremony in medieval Europe was extremely important. It was elevated to the level of sort of an unofficial sacrament in the church at the time. So the point is this in itself, it was already something extremely important. I think if we, as modern readers, we look back at this, because knighting isn't something anyone does anymore, right? Okay, well, actually, it is done, but it's an extremely. I actually completely forgot. It's an extremely sort of analogical event these days, right? But it is interesting, of course, that knightings, as we still have them, actually they originate from this practice, right? There's a direct link uh, between them. But because they're not really that present, right? It's a tiny minority of people who would ever be knighted these days, and and so for that reason, we don't really look at the knighting ceremony as something as important as it would have been in just prior to Don Quixote's time. So I think it's does we don't need to necessarily look at its parallel in something like baptism. We can just look at the what we know about knighting ceremonies. And so apropos of that, I've been reading segments from Susan Burns' excellent book, Law and History in Cervantes' Don Quixote, which is a sort of a legal reading of this book. Now, I can't remember everything, but what I'd like to do first is I'd like to set ourselves in time. So what's really important, because we need to talk about this whole question of chivalry, before we understand why the knighting ceremony was important, I think we have to start delving a little into chivalry. And setting ourselves in time is quite important here. So I know that because of where we sit in time in the 21st century, we can tend to jumble all these different eras together. But it's important to understand that the works Don Quixote is reading, many of them, were composed about a century before he lived. So Ludovico Ariosto, a lot of his works were early 1500s. Don Quixote is published in 1620, I think it's 1615 in its final, in its second part, 1605 in its first. So this is about 100 years after Ariosto had written the famous Orlando Furioso, and which was sort of like that was the bestseller chivalric romance. And in that period, so that period, the 13th, 15th century, so the 1400s, up until about the mid 1500s, a lot of the major works were produced. And then something that's also interesting is that those in themselves are being produced considerably after we conventionally assume the Middle Ages had ended. So Don Quixote himself is reading books long after they've been published that themselves are actually only reflecting on a bygone era. So this is a kind of like a level of nostalgia on top of nostalgia here that we're dealing with. Um, I just as a side note, legally this isn't as clear-cut a case. So we know as a fact that the the whole ceremonies of knighting and knighthood actually lasted well into the 1500s. We know that in the time of Philip II of Spain, um, after whom the Philippines are named, actually, the we know that laws still assumed that these knighting ceremonies would take place. Of course, laws are always quite conservative. They've been established some centuries prior, decades prior, perhaps centuries prior to any, to the moment perhaps they have become uh, deemed as being potentially outdated or something. So what I'll then add to what I've said here is that while almost probably the only chivalric romances that were composed, that come to my mind at least, that were composed during the era, during the Middle Ages, were the Song of Roland and the Arthurian corpus, the majority of the Arthurian corpus. It's important to understand that the ideal of chivalry lasted much longer than the Middle Ages itself. So this kind of code of chivalric honor that we see exemplified in the Song of Roland or in the Arthurian legends, that kind of thing it's lasting on long after kind of military norms have changed, right? Long after kind of the seated knight on his horse is no longer really that feasible. Um, it's interesting, sorry, just as a side note, that Spain is integral to this process of shifting away from that model of warfare. Uh, the Spanish armies had learned how to fight extremely effectively using pike and shot techniques first in Switzerland, and then they'd honed that system to perfection in Italy. But that's more of kind of a side comment. So I think maybe what I've said a lot here, but maybe the way I can sum it up is that chivalry has its era of formulation long before Don Quixote lives. But this ideal of chivalry lasts very long. Um, and it's still very much alive in the mid 1500s. I'm not sure how much someone of Cervantes' own era, maybe the early 1600s, would have thought of it, but it's definitely something that lasts much longer than kind of one might consider it militarily or institutionally in its prime. I've said a lot there. Any comments on that?
I think I'm just like wondering, so like there's the knight that's used in warfare,
Yeah.
and then there's the fictional knight, which is an ideal that kind of would live in the hearts and minds of the people. But
Yeah.
the is there an actual knight that is kind of living out this chivalry code in this way?
That's a really good question. Actually, I wish I wish I could answer that concretely. Okay, but I'll start with something weird that well, not weird, something that I found actually quite odd, is the way in the 1500s, the way in which these works influenced how men of state thought about their roles is remarkable, given that they're works of fiction. Um, so we know that Charles V, Emperor Charles V, who was the ruler of Spain and then the Holy Roman Empire subsequent to Ferdinand and Isabella. He was very conscious. I mean, he loved chivalric romance, and he was very conscious in trying to act as a head of state as a chivalric knight. So we actually have people who are like they are directly their actions, the way that they kind of approach the external world is directly influenced by the works that they're reading. They're actually trying to be they're trying to actually be Orlando or Roland or Arthur. I'm trying to think of some of the other major. Aquisgrán is one of the big ones in the Spanish corpus of chivalric romance. So that's one way of answering this question. And I want to return to this instant of Charles V in his court because there's something really fascinating that I think I'd like to canvass your opinions on in a moment. So that's one factor. I think the other is that while not in the individualistic fashion we see in a lot of the chivalric romances, right? A lot of these adventurers are knights errant. They're kind of going out on their own, maybe with the help of a squire, as Don Quixote himself is. There are a few chivalric romances that are actually taking place or sort of set in the context of warfare, and we just focus on one guy in the battle. Like the Song of Roland's a good example of that. But of course, these knights wouldn't generally just kind of like roam around. I don't think, certainly from what I understand, they wouldn't roam around with maybe one squire trying to right wrongs in their kingdoms. Um, so while that wouldn't happen, I think we can also, this dives back into this question of what was chivalry. And I think the point is we shouldn't be so cynical when we look at, um, when we in history see soldiers, knights' attempts, and I mean knight in the military sense, knights' attempts to live up to the chivalric code. And the reason I say this is that if you're a soldier, your life is violent, right? You're not someone, we, perhaps this is a bit controversial, but we actually have, a lot of us, the fortune of living very far away from war and soldiers, because by and large, if you go to war as a person, even in modernity, you're not going to come out of that process unscathed psychologically. It's actually going to warp your character. Um, you won't necessarily be a particularly psychologically stable person after experiencing war. And the kind of person who goes into the military is often not the sort of person who has considers they have many better options. So I think this is just a fact of life. It's a brutal thing that we fortunately, in our fairly comfortable 21st century civic life, don't have to experience, and we're very removed from. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that these knights are going to anyway pillage villages, completely burn down towns, commit atrocities. This is warfare. I think the point is that chivalry, the codes of chivalry are formulated taking that into mind. Like this stuff is going to happen anyway. Is there not something we can do to kind of curb it and get soldiers to think of get soldiers to think of a higher purpose and try reform their conduct according to a higher purpose. And when when later historians look at this and are so cynical about it and point out all the instances in which the chivalric code isn't lived up to, well, the point is it's a little bit like indicating every single time an athlete fails in their training, you know, and then pointing that out as, oh, this person wasn't really trying to win the gold medal at the Olympics. Lesedi, I see you have your hand raised.
Let me just slow down quickly. Sorry. Like when you mentioned that, it was quite like an interesting thing to mention because I've noticed that it's not just with chivalric romances. I've noticed that it's something that actually quite happens a lot, even in modern times, where people who live or who are, like figuratively pillaging and doing all these horrible things. Well, not figuratively, but actually doing horrible acts against humans. Generally, they have a weird sense of having a code, even though what they're doing, even though they are horrendously immoral, they will still have a code. Some of them will say, "No, we have rules so that we're not like the animals." Now they
Yeah.
set the code differently, and it kind of changes even when you look in like when it comes to prisons a lot of the times in prisons, men who commit acts of violence and crimes against women and children, they get treated more horribly, even though there's people in there who've killed people, who've done horrible things. It's still that sense of, okay, I'm bad, but like not that bad. Like it's almost like it's like a cop out to kind of ignore the bad you're doing by saying, okay, we might be knights that are going and pillaging these villages, but what matters is that we are chivalry we are chivalric. I don't know what the correct way to
Yeah.
use it as an antonym. I
Chivalric,
mean,
yeah.
as yeah, we chivalric. We have a code that we follow. We are gentlemanly. That kind of thought process, which is just interesting. That
Yeah.
yeah, it's also
Yeah.
yeah.
So the sense, I think also that's the other thing that you're pointing to is the inevitability of the code. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think maybe that's something also we become a little bit insensitive to when we are, uh, because so many of our codes are not explicitly established, explicitly written down uh, today, but they still exist. If you go out and you meet friends, or if you're at university, if you're in a corporate environment, there are all a whole set of codes that are unwritten, unknown, that go far beyond like any written code of conduct you have to sign or pledge to. A code is going to arise whenever you have like a community or a society. That society is going to have some of these kind of invisible codes that they operate by. So yeah, I think that point, your point yeah, your point makes sense there. Tudor, do you have anything to say there?
Very, very interesting, I think, what Lesedi and Kia brought up. Originally, for me, it was this idea of what does being a knight give Don Quixote the right to do? So I think it was interesting when he has like a discussion in this chapter with like the innkeeper, and the innkeeper's telling him, hey, but knights do need money and they need some equipment to like take care of themselves when they get hurt. So it's he's already starting to engage with this idea of the ideal versus the reality, which I thought was interesting. But what what Lesedi and Kia bring up now is that with Don Quixote, because he follows this code of chivalry, although he is a madman, his actions and the ways in which you can engage with him are very codified, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost as through this idea and like codification of knighthood, it's very clear for all the people around Don Quixote how they should interact with him, right?
Oh, yeah,
So although he's a madman, he does follow very clear and structured like laws and rules of like understanding things, you know? And the only way then to engage with him is to indulge him, but within those lines that have been set up. So I
fascinating.
think it's quite interesting. But his character as well, sometimes is willing to accept things around those codifications, provided you like your position in his mind is something. So like with the innkeeper in this chapter, it's quite interesting that the innkeeper then, if the innkeeper tells him this is what you need in order to be a knight, because in Don Quixote's mind, the innkeeper is this ruler of this castle, he has the authority to tell Don Quixote, this is what you need, you know?
Fascinating.
So I think it's interesting to see like there's sort of a madness there, but there's also very clear rules and like regulations of how to interact and how to accommodate Don Quixote. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite a brilliant insight, because it's also not something I thought of as well. It ties very closely into this question that we're trying to resolve on chivalry, right? Which is that um, when we think of being a knight, as you say, we're often not actually understanding that like the code of chivalry is sort of restricting you in a sense. It's not saying you now have the right to go and do whatever you want. It's sort of saying now you actually have to live to these codes. You've got to restrict your behavior. It's more of a power limiter than it is an sort of what would the word be? It's more of a limitation on your power than it is granting you a power in some sense. It does both, of course, but that's interesting. And of course, if we even think about our ideas of holding public office today. Uh, the idea is that as a president, as a prime minister, as a head of state of any form, ideally you're supposed to recognize far primarily what the limitations on your power are and what your responsibilities are, not what you can do with all this new power. Of course, we know as a fact, like, okay, it's highly likely that people are actually thinking more about what they can now do with their power rather than the limitations and restrictions on it. But it's interesting that we always keep those bound together in sort of our modern rituals, swearing in of a president, swearing in of a head of state, etc. Um, I mean, there was another thing that I was just thinking of as we were talking about chivalry. It, one of the components we need to explore, and I'd really like to find some resources that can help us with this, is what was actually the sort of the effect of chivalry on our thought, right? Uh, what what came to my mind immediately is that if you look at medieval resources, if you look at medieval primary sources, the historian will say something like, Emperor Zeno, for one of a better example, you know, was terrible because he put to the sword everyone in this city that he besieged, um, or you'll have a case of like this monk is attacking that archbishop because that archbishop basically led one small city state to like die of famine, right? Some city state in early Renaissance Italy to die almost entirely of famine, But I think, when we look at that, our initial instinct is kind of be quite horrified, but I wonder if it's also because we're products of that criticism. If you look at something like Julius Caesar, so when Julius Caesar famously sacks, well, when he conquers Gaul, right? And he's going on essentially, I mean, a huge portion of his motives are curiosity, right? He just wants to like know what's going on as far north as the British Isles. And also, he wants to show other people back in Rome that he's someone they should respect, right? At the time, he doesn't have a public office that's of particular prestige. He's like quite open and quite celebratory of the fact that, in his own words, he boasts that he slaughters all the Gauls that he can and captures about over 1 million slaves to be sent back to Rome, right? There's no sense that he should be like ashamed of this, that this is something wrong. For him, this is like an example of that the gods are on his side and that he is powerful. Um, and a lot of his supporters are likewise celebrating this. And it's interesting, very few of his critics accuse him of cruelty, right? So this isn't even an opportunity for his critics to accuse him. They look at that and they think, oh sure, but this guy is powerful enough to like enslave 1 million people, and completely conquer a vast swath of territory. So that's also another, I mean, that's another interesting factor. That's a massive cognitive change over time. That's a massive change in our ethical standpoint. It would be interesting in this case, like to do sort of a cross-cultural example, like what is happening, in the what's happening in the Warring States period in China. How do people in China report? Early historians in China report on acts of mass violence. Is it in the same way as Julius Caesar would? I mean, we know that it's certainly the case, like, from what I understand, it's certainly the case largely in the Persian Empire as well. They have a similar attitude towards violence in this time, in the sense that it's almost the prerogative of the strong to fulfill his. So, kind of in a sense, it would be unnatural or against nature for someone to kind of hide their power by not fully expressing it. And in a sense, I think any opposition to one's expression of power may have been couched in terms of, not in terms of some kind of ethical absolute value. It would be more couched in terms of, well, my this city state that I live in and that you are invading, we've had these time-honored traditions, we've had these customs, we know how to do things best here and how our society best functions. You shouldn't impose your ways upon us, because if you do, then in a sense, our way of doing things is going to die out. I don't know if they were necessarily couched in terms of, as we would today, in terms of rights, in terms of your civic rights. They would couch it in terms probably of like, this is actually just respecting the principle of subsidiarity. And for that reason, we even see like the Roman Empire is extremely accommodating. Um, it usually, whenever it conquers a new territory, it usually makes sure that it tries to keep things more or less as they were, and tries not to kind of antagonize the local populations. But I don't think that's out of a sense that this is intrinsically wrong. It's more out of the sense of like, this is just practically the best way of doing things. We don't want to antagonize the people we're conquering. So that's I think that's one factor that makes me think that maybe chivalry actually just had a much stronger effect on the way we think about these topics than we typically give it credit for. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Tudor.
I think it's quite interesting also earlier when you mentioned that king, um, Charles, I think you
Charles
said,
V, yeah.
yeah, who then takes on this idea of chivalry, and I think also like there's like a code of conduct.
Yeah,
It's so instrumental, I think, even like in today's terms, when you take office or take a position. So
yeah,
it's interesting to see how sort of these ideals that were set up have remained and been propagated like through time, but maybe sometimes, like you say, the the actions themselves aren't necessarily the things that get propagated. I think this is quite interesting.
yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah, I'm curious to see also in the book how it plays out
yeah,
in Don Quixote's future interaction.
yeah. Well, you see
Yeah.
here actually, you can see this is an iconic representation of Charles V's attempt to uphold the code of chivalry. This is a painting by Titian, which was, I think, yeah, it says here 1548. So this is slightly less than a century before Don Quixote was written. Um, Maybe we can move on. Unless anyone has any questions, we can move on to the next topic that I wanted to address. Lissetti, anything you want to say?
Um, it's just a tiny comment. I
Please.
don't know if it's just me or does the guy in the picture look a little bit like William Dafoe?
He actually does look a bit like Willem Dafoe. You are right. So this is Charles V. Charles V was look, he ruled considerably before Cervantes. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, but he was I mean, he was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He was the king of Spain, the emperor of the Spanish Empire. Uh, his son, through dynastic succession, his son Philip II, after whom the Philippines are named, as I mentioned, would go on to inherit both the Portuguese and Spanish empires and have territory in Italy and Central Europe. So, I mean, Charles V was the closest thing to like the king of the whole world that anyone had ever seen up to this point. Not even the Roman Empire had control of as much territory as was officially under the crown of Charles V. So he's a figure that even though he lived considerably a little bit before Cervantes, he's actually someone who affected Cervantes' life in some direct ways. Cervantes himself fought under Charles V's son. Cervantes was for a while in the Spanish Armada, so the navy, during the famous Battle of Lepanto against the Ottoman Empire, and actually famously lost the use of his left hand. Um, when I think when a beam fell on it during the naval battle. Um, and actually that ended Cervantes' career, so a military career, and we can almost thank that moment because likely because of that we actually have Don Quixote. Um, okay, so I think what I'll do is I'll move forward with the next point I wanted to make. So we've had this long discussion on chivalry, what it was, what it wasn't, how maybe best to grapple with it, and I think we have to leave it in a bit of aporia there, an unresolved matter here. I think hopefully when it becomes relevant again, we'll be more informed uh, so that we can discuss it in more precise detail. Um, I'd like to move on. There's so much that we could say here, and at the risk of kind of ignoring some really important stuff here in this scene, I want to just talk about the fact that now Don Quixote is now participating in a ritual, this ritual of being knighted. And by the way, the ritual that he follows is very much following the codes that were established at the time and that were really in force in the mid 16th century. Susan Byrne comments on this extensively, and there are and what I find interesting here is that there's a way in which this point that Tudor brought up, which is the the innkeeper is having this. He's kind of like he's joking, or he's making fun of and taking advantage of Don Quixote when he says to Don Quixote, "Well, you need to pay for the ceremony, and it's normal for knights errant to carry money on them because and the only reason this isn't mentioned in the books is that it's so obvious to anyone who's living this life that you need this money and you need to bring these like remedies, this medicine in order to heal yourself when you are injured. And this brings me to an interesting sort of dynamic here. It's an epistemological dynamic. So the way Don Quixote participates in Don Quixote's exposure to the life of the knight errant, of the chivalric knight, is entirely through literature. It's entirely through the written word. Whereas, and one of the reasons that what permits the innkeeper to make fun of him in this way is that the innkeeper pretends to actually like actively participate, have like an experiential uh, understanding of what it is to be a knight errant. So there's this kind of dynamic between like this propositional knowledge, this knowledge based on just the written word, and then the knowledge based on experience. And it's very clear that Don Quixote has the one, but not the other. And now this is the first instant in which he's now trying to like participate in this life of being a knight. Before I move on, any comments regarding that angle? Cool, because what I'll continue with is there's this interesting line. It's in one of the. It's actually in one of the. It sums up the point that I want to make now. There's a line in one of St. Paul's letters. I think it goes something like the letter killeth, but the spirit quickeneth. Quickeneth, of course, at the time is to be quick actually meant to be alive, right? So the letter kills, but the spirit gives life, and we do see kind of this idea here, right? Which is that if you have to engage with something through the written word, it's because you actually haven't lived it. And it's kind of ironic that we're seeing this in a book, because in the end of the day, the way we're kind of understanding and enjoying the story is through the written word. It's not being told to us. It's actually something we have to access at this kind of this very imperfect distance. And we know, for example, like one of the big problems in history is that a lot of the most like conventional things aren't reported, because you're not. I mean, if writing is if writing isn't easily available and it's a fairly expensive thing, you're not going to put your time writing down things like the complete mundane things. We actually have to rely on a lot of archaeology to reconstruct anything, really anything before the 20th century, actually. Like it's like that recent. It's only when printing becomes super cheap. And we actually, for example, we're living in the wake of a massive printing revolution, which is the digital age. So now we're at a state where we can update people on things as they happen through WhatsApp, through Twitter, X now, etc. And even then, we're not providing like basic details of how we live our lives. Historians, let's say in 200 years, maybe what we report on Twitter, on social media, is only going to be of marginal use to them, because they'll want to know things like, they may want to know things like, how did people like inhabit their domestic spaces? And that's not something that we comment on, because like it's a shared assumption that we have. We don't write down shared assumptions often, right? And this is a huge problem with writing. And I think that's what that quote that I just recalled is getting to. Uh, and so what actually now, then I want to pivot this point here. So having established this fundamental difference between like print culture and non-print culture, one of the things I want to now pivot is the way in which the one actually influences modes of participation and modes of experience. We've got before us this picture of this portrait of Charles V. One of the things that really struck me as super interesting is not only did Charles V and a lot of his contemporaries read these works of chivalric romance and actually try and live as chivalric knights in fulfilling their duties and in living as heads of state. They were like really conscious of trying to be like these, imitate their heroes. So at one moment when Charles V was trying to, actually about the time that this portrait was taken, in fact, when this portrait was taken, okay, this was taken midway through a whole campaign that Charles V undertook in order to get his son, Philip II, approved of as his heir. And so he not only had to do this throughout the kingdoms of Spain, he had to do it in a lot of the territory of the Holy Roman Empire. So he had to go around like Margrave, Principality, city-state by city-state, and get all of the nobles to swear allegiance to his son. His sister, Maria of Hungary, during one of these festivities, that was these sort of political festivities, it was designed in order to win Philip II the favor of these various polities. She sets up. I was astonished when I read this, but she sets up almost kind of an obstacle course for all of these noblemen to compete in. So there's a jousting tournament, but then like afterwards, there's this obstacle course where the goal is for them to save someone in a castle. Okay, so they literally have these series of obstacles. And I mean, when we're talking about series of obstacles, we're talking about lakes they have to cross. I mean, this is happening over a massive distance, right? Fields they need to ride through, lakes they have to cross, kind of like, they may even have been like sort of dummies they have to knock down, wooden dummies they have to knock down, also that they can penetrate into this castle and then save, I don't know who, I would assume like some damsel in distress from, to use modern terminology, the boss villain. Like this is actually happening in like the 1540s. And it's like really, it sounds really weird to us. I mean, I suppose it throws into relief things like Comic Con, right? It might seem initially like, okay, that's a bit weird that people are dressing up as these characters because, like, you're not Harry Potter. You can't wave your wand and fix your glasses. Um, Although maybe you've wished you could at times, Tudor. Um, but we can't do these things. So why are we like? Isn't it just an exercise in futility and frustration? Like, aren't we just going to become more aware of the fact that we're not Deadpool, no matter how much we may look like him in our cosplay? But there's this interesting idea of like, there's a similar dynamic here. We're reading something, and then people are like, they're trying to participate in the story that they're reading. There's something very liturgical about all of this. I don't know if you guys have any comments because it really is something that sort of astonished me when I read this.
It just reminds me of Takeshi's Castle when you're describing
Yes.
it. But
Yeah.
I'm even just thinking now of like how much of an impact it's had on like thinking and narratives of like identity of like one's purpose,
Yeah. Yeah.
navigating, even as like children when you play, like these are
Exactly.
like roles and ideals one takes on, and it's so interesting. I think also to think that okay, even a few hundred years ago, these like grown men would be taking on these roles and like playing around,
And
in
and actually
their
dressing up. Maybe I left this up. They actually were dressing up as like, yeah, okay, not
yeah,
Galahad because he's a negative character, but as Arthur, as
yeah,
Orlando, as Roland, as yeah, as
mm,
all of these different heroes these people who would have been their heroes. It's kind of astonishing, this sort of impetus we have to enact what we what we admire in some sense
yeah.
in fiction. Kia, I see you nodding there.
Yeah, I am nodding. I think I'm like, okay, cool. So if it is like a kind of playful thing, like at what point is it like they're just like it's like a dress up party, you
Yes.
or Comic Con or whatever. But like if I come to a dress up party dressed as Princess Leia, it doesn't necessarily mean in my daily life I've um really internalized the values
Yeah.
and code of what it means to be this noble princess. So I'm like there's this separation there, like, and also like
Hmm.
how seriously are they taking it? Like, I guess if they're coming dressed as like Arthur, then there's a sense of like, okay, no, this is playful, but then it's like, would someone die for making fun of them? Kind of is like that sense of like kind of the nobility as being kind of spoiled adults that had a lot of power and could do what they want. So it's like, yes, it's playful, but if someone kind of laughed at them, like some people laugh at people who dress up as Deadpool when they go to Comic-Con, like would someone die kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a very but this is the thought, I guess.
No, I think, look, I think that's highly unlikely that they would have taken personal offense to it. But what we do know as a fact is that they were trying to live up to these ideals that they saw in their fictional, in sort of their fictional heroes. But I
Yeah.
think you make a good point. Like maybe they weren't, like maybe this wasn't as serious. But it also does seem to like sort of correspond to like this what we know about how they try to fulfill their regular day-to-day duties.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think this, but maybe, you know, we could we could we could go back to this point in Aristotle's Poetics, right? And for anyone who's listening, just the context here is that it's fair to say that Aristotle's Poetics, which were composed about 300 BC, right? I mean, it's fair to think of them as the first um, concerted effort at literary theory, at formulating any sort of literary theory in history. Um, it's a bit difficult because it's like this sort of this typical. It's difficult to read because it's in this typical Aristotelian truncated prose, because it actually turns out that they're mostly notes taken by his students, notes that they'd taken from his lectures in at the academy. Now, what what's interesting in that is that Aristotle says all stories can be divided by their modes of narration into two parts. So there's, on one hand, there's diegesis, so that's a case where there's a narrator, um, and it's very clear who the narrator is, and the narrator is kind of the person who's linking the events together. So that typical thing, once upon a time, is a classic example of diegesis, because there's like this omnipotent person who knows what's happening, and he's using his words, or she's using her words, to kind of link all the events together. Um, a good example of this would be Charles Dickens, right? So Charles Dickens, the narrator is very rarely a character. I mean, sometimes they're like written in first person, but okay, maybe Charles Dickens actually isn't the best example. Harry Potter might be a good example, right? The narrator doesn't have a character or a personality. It's just like that omnipotent person, that voice that's linking all the events together for us. So that's diegesis. And then the other kind of narration is mimesis. So I'm appealing to all of, like, especially Tudor, your background in drama therapy. And mimesis is this case in which the events are portrayed, the events take place just by portrayal. So there's not really a narrator. These things are kind of just, they're physically manifesting before us. That's theater, actually. And today, because movie and television are, in a sense, as media forms, descended from theater, uh, you very rarely will find a narrator, right? So it's kind of common. It's very common just for your television series, your TV drama, just to have like the set of images and the characters dialoguing with each other. You won't necessarily have like a guy who's providing an overall narration, and even if you do, it's like tiny. You know, he's only like providing necessary links where it's possible. So it's like minimally diegetic, one might say. Um, and I wonder, because I think Aristotle might actually point towards this, I wonder if the one form lends itself more to imitation than the other. Like, if we see things like mimetically represented in theater, so on stage, in TV, I mean, today, graphic novels like manga, for example, are a good example of primarily, even though we kind of read them, they're actually primarily mimetic in the sense that they're just showing us like a series of images, and that's what the story is. There's not prose or texts linking the story together. Um, I wonder if like that actually just lends itself a lot more to imitation, right? So like maybe part of the craze for things like cosplay is largely because a huge portion of the fiction we're exposed to is mimetic fiction. It's stuff we see represented in front of us, and there might be this almost kind of like anthropological urge to like replicate, to mimic what we're actually seeing physically before us. Like maybe it's just like we feel that a lot more viscerally than we would if we read it out. Maybe another way of putting this is, if Harry Potter never became a series of films, would people cosplay Harry Potter? And I'm not convinced they actually would that much. And I'm not convinced Comic Con would take off if you pardon like the platitude, it won't Comic Con, right? You know, people who are watching movies based on comics or reading comics in which like this thing is like physically quite clearly represented in front of them. I don't know what you guys have to say about that, because it's a little bit of a tangent from what we're discussing, but it's something that's been on my mind for a while.
I think I think the easiest way I look at it, if I'm trying to look at it away from cosplay, and in a way that's more socially acceptable technically than cosplay, is how we look up to certain celebrities in the form of athletes. So if you see Neymar,
Yeah,
you want to wear a football jersey with the Neymar on it, and you won't be necessarily be seen as like out there as like doing a cosplay of Iron Man, for example. It's
yeah,
more straightforward, but you kind of still doing the same thing. It's just more socially acceptable. And even just wanting to play like him, wanting to do Neymar's skill. If you're playing soccer with your mates, you're like, oh, I want to do the new thing that Neymar did on that weekend, you know?
yeah.
I guess that's how I kind of like, I guess, look at it maybe.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think you're right. Actually that's entirely like it's this way in which kind of you you if we want to put it in terms of the literature, right? You see the chivalric knight who's the sports star, right? You
Mhm.
see Messi on screen. Uh, you kind of like you absorb, you drink in this narrative, the story that you're seeing as the game unfolds, and then you want to like it's not enough for it just to rest there. You want to actually like participate in it. You want to be, in some sense, what you admire, what you're seeing on the screen, you know? I always think about there's this really interesting thing, you know, the tradition of stained glass windows in medieval churches, right? I think that's also filling like a similar function to TV in a way, right? Like there's this light shining through, and like psychologically, as people see that, I think it's very difficult not to, in some sense, want to be like this thing that you're seeing, you know, um, especially if it's portrayed in such a way that you're meant to admire it.
Mhm. And I think one last super quick comment. This is just in relation. I know I got cut off for a bit, load shedding and stuff, but I'm okay now. Um, but how you guys were mentioning something along the lines of um, the, the people who are kind of like emulating the knights and beating up anyone who would kind of like make fun of them for that. And I thought the closest like modern day comparison is actually the Mexican cartels. I found out a few months ago that the Mexican cartels are some of like the biggest Dragon Ball Z fans,
Yeah,
and it's like it's a whole joke out there. And I'm just thinking about how if you can disrespect Goku in front of them, if they're wearing a Goku top or something, and you disrespect Goku or them, yeah, you're gonna have a very interesting afternoon considering
yeah.
how ruthless those guys are. So yeah, that's just my last comment on that.
No, I appreciate that. I think that injects like that injects a very good modern example into this. But yeah, there's I'm just generally fascinated with this idea of imitation and what we admire. You know, there's this quite and I think one of the reasons for this is that we like to think of ourselves as a very progressive age, right? In which like we're rational. I think that's what I mean by that is like perhaps since the Enlightenment, we've got this idea of like everything we do should be based upon these very carefully formulated logical steps of reasoning. And then when you look at something like this, it seems complete madness that you would want to be like these people we admire, real or fictional. But it's like it seems to just conform to this very almost like tribal, uh, like actually sort of this instinct we see in babies, right? If you stick your tongue out to an infant, what does the baby do? Well, immediately she's going to stick her tongue out as well. And a huge way in which like we know animals learn from each other through this process of imitation. It's so like it's so deeply entrenched in us, and I think that there's possibly no book in the world that is so conscious of this dynamic as Don Quixote. Cool.
Uh,
Anything? Yes, please, Kia, go ahead.
yeah, I don't know how you would say that. How do you decide that Don Quixote is like most conscious of that thing? Maybe it'll come out.
No,
Um,
I may be sort of completely wrong, but I'm trying to think. I don't know a book in which, well, could you think of a story, for example, in which like the main character, so much of what the main character does is predicated on his imitation of a fictional ideal? because I think
Okay, that's what you meant.
there are some, but
Yeah.
there are some, but I think they're almost always consequences of Don Quixote, you know?
Okay. Okay. I think I was tapping into the idea of like mimesis being like very, very key in terms of like mimetic devices being like very important to like morality and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, I don't know if that would be the similar word. But I was also just thinking about this idea of mimesis and if looking is the key part of it or participating it is.
Yeah.
Because I was kind of like thinking about like what stuff has driven me into imitation, like not necessarily just on a superficial level, but like on a deeper level, like how playing Sims would often feel like I would bring that into like the way I engage with
Interesting.
my world thereafter. And it's like I could see my like irritation bar at the bottom of the screen when I'm like walking around the house or like that kind of thing, like that level of internalization. And that feeling like maybe that's games rather than like purely images
Yeah.
are a big part of what like helps internalize that. And then again, like with your games that you were talking about, but also what Lasedi said about, actually, no, we're probably running short on time and I'm going to go on a tangent.
We probably are actually. We just dived into this really intricate point, and we actually haven't got too far through the story but I think we can more or less leave this off here. You've given us a good synopsis. We actually know what happens, um, and I've said more or less all of my notes here. I've kind of exhausted the notes that I have here. So I would just want to hand the floor over to each of you in turn. Time isn't too much of an issue for me, so I'd like you guys to provide any other comments or any of your thoughts and notes on this chapter here. Anything that happens here that you feel we haven't quite really looked at?
Um, I think I had 2 points. The one I think came from me somehow thinking that the trough was for pigs and not for donkeys. So I think that note kind of falls away. But the other one was this convincing of Don Quixote that it's so obvious that we should use that knights use money, that's why they didn't write about it. And then I don't know, I was reading at some point that no, it was a literal ideal that they didn't care about material gain. And kind of that comparison with the conquistadors who like a big part of their goal was to get rich. So I'm just kind of wondering if there's like that influence of like that's a part of where that value is coming from. But also I think it kind of links quite nicely into this idea that you brought up earlier of like we don't write down shared assumptions.
Yeah.
So I'm not really sure which one that is, but it could be both, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree with that. I think that's quite right. Actually, talking about the conquest of the Americas is quite interesting as well. We'll save that for another time. But for example, California, just to give you an idea, California is actually named after a kingdom in one of these chivalric romances.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
That'd
yeah.
be cool.
So one of the reasons that people were so excited about these chivalric romances at the time is that they felt that they were actually seeing people discovering new worlds and like making in a lot of these stories like the knight errant is going to find like a foreign people and he'll like make an alliance with them and then he'll have friends amongst the foreign people and he'll have enemies amongst the foreign people, and that's of course happening like with all the alliances that the Spanish bands, I mean they're not official armies ever actually, but essentially like these kind of like private corporations uh, are now forming with like this one group, like the Tlaxcala against the Aztecs, etc. So people also like this is also another example of like narrative really influencing history. Tudor, anything here in this chapter you think we haven't sufficiently covered?
Mm, I don't think the chapter highlights it, but I think maybe it would also be interesting. I think with this chapter again, it brings up from what was discussed how much of it is Don Quixote conscious of his imitation and how much isn't he?
Hmm.
Because I think like in the chapter, well, what was a bit strange for me was that Don Quixote was so willing to accept the innkeeper's um, belief that 2 hours was enough, 4 hours was enough, and
Yeah,
so on. And now he is a knight, and now he can move on.
very
So
arbitrary.
I think it's the chapter itself doesn't lend it doesn't lend itself to showcase or sort of give us a better understanding of it. But I think in future, it'll be interesting to see when Don Quixote is quite stubborn in his beliefs and
Hmm.
when he isn't.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And maybe it's a question of authority as well. So
yeah,
Don Quixote is gives way so easily to the innkeeper because he thinks he's the Señor Castellano, the keeper of the castle. Señor Lesedi.
Yeah, so I'm kind of somewhat along the same line of thoughts as Tudo, in the sense that like this guy has finally got like his first cosign, his first person to feed into his delusions.
Yeah,
And that's just, yeah, I can't wait to see how it's gonna go. I want to
yeah,
see how many other people are gonna feed into it. And I want to see, because now we're still in a closed environment. We're still like in the inn place, the inn, sorry. So I'm excited to see how this kind of plays out. And oh yes, I just realized now. I just realized it's I kind of realized that a lot of us would kind of do what the innkeeper has done, because like whenever you're out and about, or logically, if you're out and about and there's some random guy, there's all these random guys who seem crazy, and the guy is telling you that he has the keys to the space station that is hidden in the bottom of the earth. You're not gonna say, bro, there's nothing like that. You're gonna say, oh yeah, sure, really. You kind of gonna feed into it. So I think
yeah,
thinking about it, I've realized like I wonder how many people are gonna feed into it like that. Like some random guy comes up to them and says, "Yeah, I'm a knight of the what," and that person just wants to take the taxi home or the horse carriage home, and they just thinking to themselves, "Yeah, yes, yes," and they just go along. So I'm
yeah.
excited to see if there's anything like that, because I would find that very amusing.
Well, that's actually a perfect way to finish this off because that's going to be the next chapter. In the next chapter, to anticipate, to provide a bit of anticipation here, we see this. Don Quixote leaves the inn. Now he's been knighted in this whole ceremony, and he leaves the inn and he encounters the first injustice that he believes it's his duty to correct. And we'll see how the man who's purportedly performing the injustice reacts to Don Quixote's censure. Uh, I want to say thank you to everyone for your time and for joining us, and also especially for your very insightful comments. I enjoyed it a lot. I always learn, like, it's amazing. We always learn so much because the perspective that others bring in to these chapters always highlights something that actually I would never, ever, ever have thought of on my own. And yeah, so thank you very much, everyone. And we will see each other all again for the next session in a few weeks' time, chapter 4. Adios.